Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to our third and final webinar for 2025. This one's going to go over food contact surfaces and bathrooms. My name is Sarah Music. I am the produce safety coordinator here, and I do education, outreach, and farm inventory. So we are just going to get started here. So this is kind of the agenda. These are the things that we will be going over today. We will be going over food contact surfaces. We're going to kind of go over zones in a pack house, what we mean by that, and then also cleaning and sanitizing, what that looks like underneath the produce safety rule. Then also kind of adjacent with food contact surfaces is bathrooms. What is the produce safety rule? What does that require? What is proper hand washing? What all of that looks like? And then of course we're going to end with resources and records. So again, going to go into food contact surfaces. What does that mean? At least with the produce safety rule, what that looks like. So as far as the produce safety rule is concerned, this is the very broad definition of what a food contact surface is. It means surfaces that the produce may or does come into contact with. That can be the whole gambit of different things. That can be tables, bins, specifically harvest bins, sinks, especially if you are dunking your produce, right? If you're dunking water, it could potentially be touching something else, so kind of keeping that in mind. But then also another big one is workers' hands or even workers' gloves, if that is something that you if that's something you do on your operation as well. But also, to be clear, for the food contact surface definition, this is all surfaces of equipment and tools used in harvest, packing, and holding. Kind of the examples I'll be giving is for a pack house, but I'll try to also give examples for what harvesting and holding would look like. So just kind of keep that in mind, that food contact surfaces go all the way through your operation, but I might just, as the examples I give, maybe more pack house specific. So if you have taken that PSA grower training, it might have been a few minutes, but something that is covered is the zones of a pack house. So this is something, especially if you have gotten or are getting an on-farm readiness review, this is something that I kind of touch on. I usually either say, what are your food contact surfaces? Or I say, what is your zone ones? So a zone one is anything that comes into contact with your produce. So it's your direct food contact surface. And that can be equipment, tools, and all of that needs to be inspected. It needs to be maintained, cleaned, and then when necessary, sanitized. You don't need to sanitize every time you use your equipment. However, we'll kind of get into why creating a clean break is vital. And then as far as the zone one as the examples, these are just some of them, just to kind of give you a better idea of what we mean by a direct food contact surface. So it could be belts, it could be rollers, brushes. If you use a sorting table of any kind, of course, workers' hands, especially if it's directly touching that produce. Bins, this can also mean harvest bins as well. Where are the harvest bins going? What are they touching? Especially if they have holes on the bottom, can produce maybe touch something underneath that harvest bin? That's why you may have heard us talk about like having a sacrifice bin or having something elevate the harvest bin that you're working in, because since it is a direct food contact surface, it not touching the soil or anything. So then that way, typically with bins, they're typically stacked. So what's on the bottom of that bin may come into direct contact with produce. So kind of keeping that in mind as well, is that while it might not be something you might think about, it might be something that could potentially become a zone one or your direct food contact surface. The other zones you may have heard of is zone 2, 3, and 4. So what zone 2 means is that it's directly or adjacent to a zone 1. So it's pretty close to the produce. Something that I do want to add as far as a zone two is it could have the potential of becoming a zone one depending. And I'll kind of get into that. I have a picture later on and I'll kind of like go into a little bit more detail about that. But anything close to the produce is going to be considered zone two. This could be, especially in a pack house, that could be your processing equipment or your belt line or anything along those lines. It could be like the outside of it. That would be considered a zone two. So something maybe your workers might be leaning against. So kind of keeping that in mind if you are using something like that in your pack house, if that's something you have available. Zone three is just outside of that. So if you do have a pack house or your pack house area, something to kind of think about is if you have coal bins, if you have a floor, even if you have an open pack house, what's on your floor? Do you let the coals kind of drop on the floor and then you sweep at the end of the day? That's something to kind of consider. Drains is a big one. So with drains is making sure that they're properly draining. They're not going to get backed up and then having standing water. What we know with standing water is the potential for listeria. Listeria grows in both cold and warm climates. So that's why it's very important to make sure that your drains are properly draining. And then another one that I think people kind of forget about is forklifts. So I do know, especially like on bigger operations, they might have a designated forklift for that pack house. It doesn't leave the pack house. It just takes, the produce from one area and puts it into the cooler. But something to think about, especially if you're a smaller grower, is where does that forklift go? So if it doesn't just stay in your pack house, is it going through gravel? Is it going through your fields? Are you picking up harvest bins with the forklift itself, or are you putting them on a pallet? So kind of keeping that in mind is that where that forklift goes, it could become a potential contaminant. So kind of keep that in the back of your head of like how your operation uses that forklift and where it goes. And then, of course, zone four is then everything else outside of your pack house or your harvesting area. It could be a loading dock if you have one, the warehouse that you're working in, compost piles if that's where you keep it, but making sure that that is a clean area. Kind of like what I had touched on in the previous webinar about packing and holding is are you making sure that it's weed free around your pack house, right? Or your cooler, if that is also something, just because a mouse or even like little rodents, all they need is a quarter of an inch to get in somewhere. So making sure that you're able to keep those weeds low so then that way it doesn't give them a place to hide is something that we recommend. But that would be what is considered a zone four. So just to kind of illustrate with a picture, what do I mean by all the different zones? Just to kind of, again, conceptualize what that would mean. So your zone one's your direct food contact surfaces. Hopefully, as you can see from this picture, it would be the rollers, right? It's coming into direct contact with the apples. And then also the white part over here would also be a food contact surface. Now the edges here, that could potentially be a zone one, or it could also be considered a zone two. If the apples don't touch it directly, it would be considered a zone two. However, that's the area where it could be a potential zone two that turns into a zone one. So kind of keep that in mind of, does my produce actually touch the side of my equipment? If it does, I'm going to have to treat that as a food contact surface versus a zone two. Zone three, as you can see, that would be the floor and everything there. I don't see a coal bin, but as you see this worker back here, working on this line specifically. But yeah, so the zone three would be like the floors, the drains, anything along those lines. And then of course, zone four is then the full pack house itself. So more on the outside, making sure that looks good and everything. And specifically, as you can see, this is a pretty big operation, but they do have this stairwell here. and then the walkway over here. This could potentially be a zone 2 or a zone 3, again, just depending on what that floor is like. Most of those floors do have holes, so something to consider is that if workers are walking on that, most people what they do is they require them to wear booties. So if there was anything on their shoes, it's not then dropping on the produce, making it a direct food contact surface, and then again adulterating apples that are being packed and then being put into a cooler. So again, just some things to kind of consider that it may be a zone 3, but it could potentially be a zone 2 or a zone 1, depending on where it's located in conjunction with produce. Something else that I would also um, tell you about is if you have lights above your packing equipment. This picture doesn't really show it, but making sure that it's shatterproof or LED lights that are above that or have some kind of shatter guard so that way if a light bulb were to break, it's not then adulterating your produce. Those would be considered a zone 3, but again has the potential to become a direct food contact surface. So again, kind of keeping that in mind if there's anything above that could potentially fall onto your equipment. So we went through the different zones, we went over food contact surfaces. So now we're going to get into, well, what does cleaning and sanitizing those direct food contact surfaces look like? So underneath the produce safety rule, this is what we consider cleaning and sanitizing. Cleaning is the physical removal of dirt from surfaces using clean water and detergent. So I do want to emphasize with cleaning and sanitizing, the water that you're using has to meet the harvest and post-harvest requirements. So that would be that there's no detectable generic E. coli, you're not using untreated surface water, that it's adequate in sanitary quality for its intended use. If you're using a well, you can. You would just have to show tests showing that there's no detectable generic E. coli. If you're on municipal water, you would just have to have the records from the water district that you use. So that sometimes that's either the city or the county that you live in to get their report. If it meets the EPA drinking water standard, it meets harvest and post-harvest water requirements. So kind of keep that in mind. That's all you would have to show an inspector. That's what they would be looking for. So that's what cleaning is. And then sanitizing is then treating that clean surface to reduce the microorganisms that are there. Something that I do want to emphasize, because we do see this confusion a lot, especially I've seen it in smaller growers, is you cannot sanitize a dirty surface. You have to clean first. And that just means, because I have seen where people think, oh, well, I used bleach. That must have killed anything that was there. Well, yes and no. You have to make sure that you're really scrubbing to make sure that you're lifting up any of those soil particles or anything that would be on that surface. Treating it with bleach doesn't necessarily mean that you've treated it for any microorganisms that are there if you're just using bleach. You can use bleach in a solution, but you can't just use bleach without using some kind of cleaning step first. And we'll get into that here. So as far as, well, what kind of cleaning steps do you mean? What is an inspector going to be looking for when you say cleaning and sanitizing? So here are the cleaning steps that we kind of look for. So first is making sure that you're removing the dirt and debris from, let's say, a harvest bin, right? So you're making sure that you're getting that off. You can use a brush. You can use powered air if you want to, or pressurized air, or water. Some people use like a power washer. If that is something you're wanting to do, like compressed air or a power washer, something that I do want to kind of, keep in the back of your mind is to make sure that it's not going to contaminate your direct food contact surfaces, especially if those harvest bins, because I've seen, especially if it's really muddy out there and they're caked in mud, you're going to have to get that off. Sometimes you need to power wash them just to get that off. Is doing it in an area that's not going to also then contaminate your food contact surfaces. So I know a lot of operations, they do this outside, this kind of step. So then that way, if there's any debris that's coming off, it's not also getting onto their pack line. So kind of keep that in mind whenever you're removing your debris, doing it in a way that you don't also then contaminate your clean bins. Then once you do that, applying a detergent and scrubbing the surface, right? Using a brush, really getting in there, making sure what we mean by detergent is you can use Dawn dish soap. Or I know what a lot of growers use is seventh generation or any kind of soap along that. If you can use it on food contact surfaces, I know Dawn, obviously you don't have to use Dawn, but something similar. And then just scrubbing the surface. Really getting in there, right? Making sure you're getting all those nooks and crannies. And then what you can do after that is then step 3, rinsing it with water, making sure you're getting all that soil or any other debris that's in there. And the detergent, again, the water for these steps do have to meet that harvest and post-harvest requirements again. So, making sure it's, no detectable generic E. coli if you're using that municipal water that it's meeting the drinking water standard, and then having those water test records showing that it meets that. And then, of course, then step 4 is applying a sanitizer. Make sure that it's approved for food contact surfaces. Some sanitizers, depending, I think it's Sanidate. I don't know which one, but one of the Sanidates requires you to rinse it afterwards. Like it has to stay on the surface for like 10 minutes and then you have to rinse it off. So making sure that you're reading the EPA label to make sure that what you're using as a sanitizer can not only go on food contact surfaces, but if there's any other steps that you have to follow to make sure that you are actually doing what you need to be doing. As far as the sanitizer, I do know most farms use some kind of peracetic acid or a Sanidate. Some you can use bleach, but again, make sure to check that EPA label for food contact surfaces. We had noticed, especially during the COVID time, is that they were just trying to get bleach out. And some of them with the EPA label weren't supposed to be used for food contact surfaces or to be used in rinse water. So kind of keep that in mind to make sure to check that EPA label to make sure your sanitizer is what you need it to be doing. And then if you do all of those steps, applying a sanitizer, again, you don't have to sanitize every time, just what is adequate and necessary. What that looks like for each operation is going to be different. A lot of them, it's they clean them at the beginning of the day, but then they clean and sanitize at the end. What I always tell farms is what can you do when it's 16-hour days and you're in the, peak of harvest? What can you do? So some days that just might not mean you can sanitize, and that's okay. However, having a record showing when you do that, so you can show that you have that clean break, right? Showing a record of this was what was cleaned, this was what was sanitized, because again, heaven forbid, knock on wood, if there were ever to be an outbreak, this would be something that would be looked at, right? Like when was there a sanitizing step, not only a sanitizing step, but a cleaning step too, right? So when did they clean? When did they sanitize? So then that way, instead of having to recall everything over years, it may be just a specific lot. So kind of keeping that in mind of where do you feel the most comfortable creating a clean break, and then being comfortable that that might be all the produce that might have to be recalled if that was to ever be a situation you would see yourself in. So again, kind of keep that in mind when you're going through your different steps and what you can do for your operation specifically. All right, so that is zones and food contact surfaces and all of that. Now we're going to get into bathrooms, what the requirements are. We're going to go over proper hand washing and all of that. So, as far as toilet and hand washing facilities, what the rule requires is a sufficient number of toilets and sinks. At least under the produce safety rule, we follow OSHA. So OSHA requires at least one facility per 20 workers. It needs to be within a quarter of a mile or a 5-minute drive. That's the bare minimum. That would be something that an inspector would be looking for. So if they don't see a toilet out in where they're harvesting for that day, they will be making sure that this is met. They also need to be fully serviced on a regular schedule. What that regular schedule, again, is up to you. Does that mean every day they're checked or every couple days? Especially again at peak of harvest, what can you do? So some of them are serviced by a third party, so you can just let the inspector know, like, oh, it's every couple days they come out and clean it and they sign. Usually in porter potties and stuff like that, is there's a record on the inside of the door where they sign and date. Make sure that your third party is actually doing that or providing you an invoice of when they're being cleaned, so then that way an inspector would be able to see that. Also being well stocked. We're going to get into that in a few slides here of what does it mean to be a well stocked toilet and hand washing facility, but it does need to be stocked because if it's not, then they're not going to be using it, right? If it's not cleaned on a regular basis, if it's not stocked with the things that they need, where will they be going to the bathroom? More than likely, and we've seen this from previous outbreaks, is they will relieve themselves either in the field or adjacent to the field. So kind of keep that in mind of, oof, how often should I be checking to make sure that this is happening? And then, of course, should be monitored daily when in use, especially again at peak harvest. If they're, stopping for breaks, they should be washing their hands. If they need to use the restroom when they're out there, making sure that they have the proper stuff to do so. So, as far as toilet facilities, this is something the last two aren't required, but the top ones are. These are what the toilet facility should have. They should obviously have a toilet, right? Toilet paper, soap, clean water. Again, that needs to meet the harvest and post-harvest requirements. Paper towels, or as the rule says, it's single-use device if you're not wanting to use paper towels. Something that you're going to have to do then is a towel for each person. So, meaning you would have to have a basket of clean towels and a basket of dirty towels. So, they take a clean towel, wipe their hands, put it in that dirty basket, and having it shown distinctly of which one, right? So, making sure that only one person uses one towel, but then also something to keep in mind too is then that you would have to launder those and making sure that they're clean and then ready for the next day. If that is something that you're interested in, I know a lot of the smaller operations are wanting to go green, but usually paper towels is king, but kind of keep that in the back of your head if you ever wanted to switch. And then, of course, the wastewater from your hand washing facility, right, is making sure that it's not dripping into your harvest field. This also goes for your toilets as well, as making sure, especially if they're on a platform, can they potentially leak into your harvest field? What would you do if that happened? And making sure that it doesn't. So making sure there's a container to catch that wastewater. Typically in the picture here that you see, the wastewater is collected at the bottom, but making sure that there are no leaks. And then if there is a leak, that you have the phone number for the third party who services your toilet facilities, or if it's you yourself, and making sure that it gets fixed on a regular basis. And then, of course, a garbage can, right? They need a place to be able to throw their paper towels. Otherwise, you would have paper towels all over your field, potentially, again, contaminating your produce. Because if a towel that was used to dry their hands gets onto produce, that would be a direct food contact surface. You don't know how clean that paper towel is, especially if they just wash your hands from going to the restroom. Something to think about, right? And then the next two, the rule does say for a break area, you're required to have a break area. But with the first aid kit, this one is just so that way, especially if you're using harvest tools, if you're using harvest tools to, I know a lot of people use it for like leafy greens or cabbages sometimes, but not always, like with peppers or cucumbers or anything along those lines. If they by chance like nick themselves, right, and they're bleeding, you don't want them to continue to bleed all over the produce and maybe just kind of contain that to one area. Making sure that the first aid kit has the things that if someone were to get cut that they would be able to clean themselves up with. So making sure that they have band-aids, gauze, maybe some, Neosporin or something along those lines, but making sure that you not only have a first aid kit, but that it's viable, right? It's not going to have expired stuff in there. So then by the time that it is actually needed, they would be able to use it. And then the break area, all the rule says it just needs to be in a designated area that's not in the harvesting field. So that can be on the side of the road, that could be up at your main operation place if that's what it is. What that break area, it doesn't have to be in a building, but it does have to be outside the harvest field. So whatever that looks like for you works for us, kind of thing. But that would be something an inspector would be looking for is where's the designated break area? If they do see a potential break, sometimes that happens. Where are they sitting? Are they going to contaminate any produce? That kind of thing. And then also making sure that they're washing their hands after coming back from a break. So I have seen that a few times where I've gone out to facilities where I noticed, workers just finishing up a break, getting back into the field, and none of them had washed their hands. So again, kind of keep that in the back of your head. So I've done a lot of talking of like, this is what you need to do, but what about the workers, right? It doesn't just fall all on you, but the workers also have some of that responsibility as well, is that they need to make sure they maintain their personal cleanliness, that they're coming to your farm in clean clothes. Something that I do want to again put the seed in the back of your head is, do your workers have livestock at their houses? And does the clothes that they wear on your farm, the same clothes that they use to clean out the chicken coop, shovel poop from their, cattle or anything? So again, kind of knowing like where their shoes were. Are those shoes the same ones they go into the chicken coop with? Because we do know chickens naturally have salmonella. So, and then are those same shoes then coming onto your farm operation? So making sure that they're not also becoming a contamination point is something that they need to be doing. They need to also maintain, if you use them, there's no requirement under the rule for you to have to use gloves or aprons or anything along those lines. However, if you do, they have to be maintained in a sanitary way, meaning if they are going to the bathroom, that they're not putting their gloves in their back pocket and then walking into the porta potty, right? Because especially anything in there could get on the gloves. They could be touching on their gloves after they've relieved themselves. And then that could pose a huge risk right there. So, and then also aprons, again, since it's in the front, making sure to have a hook right outside the bathroom so they can hang up anything. Having a spot, especially if you're out in the field, with gloves, having a designated place that they can put not only their gloves, but I would also say tools. So again, if you're using any kind of shear knife or knife or anything, that they're not just stacking it into the soil, because again, that's a food contact surface. You don't want to put it into soil that you don't know what's in. So then you want a designated place for anything like that that would be a direct food contact surface. Again, especially in a covered activities, so like harvest, packing, and holding, they're not eating, chewing gum, using tobacco, especially tobacco around tomato plants, right? Making sure that they're not doing that while they're harvesting. They can eat and use tobacco in designated areas. So again, having that designated break area If you have anyone that does smoke, that they do it in a designated area, and especially if you're dealing with tomatoes, making sure that they wash their hands, right? So then that way it doesn't cause any issues for you. And then, of course, if they are sick, they should feel comfortable enough going to a supervisor or a manager of some kind and just being like, hey, I just don't feel good, well enough to be harvesting today. Um, Not only that, but then also any other workers who are like, this person, their color is off, they look gray, they look yellow, it looks like they've been going to the bathroom every 5 minutes. I don't know if there's a medical issue there or if they're really sick. Someone might want to check in on them, those kind of things. And then, of course, because hands touch produce, washing their hands, right? Making sure that they're doing that when they're supposed to. So, coming back from a break, every time that they go to the bathroom, they should be washing their hands. Also, if they come into contact with anything that may have contaminated their hands. So, again, if they got a cut on their hand, that they wash them. If they accidentally, because sometimes, we're all human, they touch produce that may have been contaminated by an animal. So that could be either they didn't see it from the other side, but it looked like maybe the birds had pecked at the cherries and they didn't see it, washing their hands. Or if it typically produce with bird feces or deer or elk or whatever animals are in your area, that if they do accidentally touch any of that produce, that again, they're washing their hands. So I've kind of gone over like, hey, like you need to be washing your hands, but what does proper hand washing look like? So I'm sure I know all of us have gone through COVID, but it doesn't help to have that reminder, right, of wetting your hands, applying soap and lather, rubbing for at least 20 seconds, right? The happy birthday song, rinsing their hands. And this is the bullet point that I like to highlight because sometimes I think this is forgotten, is drying your hands with a paper towel, but then using that paper towel to turn off the tap, right? That faucet. The why behind that is, well, if they just came out of the porta potty and turned the water on, their hands were dirty. And then again, since they properly washed their hands, they now become direct food contact surfaces. And then if they touch a dirty faucet handle, they just contaminated their hands, which then potentially touch produce or even harvest bins, causing an issue there. So making sure that they do that. I would also say, it's in the pack house, so they may have to open a door, right? So if they have to open a door as well, so they could turn off the faucet, but then you may have, like this last bullet here is throwing the paper towel in a trash can, making it like a no-brainer of putting it near the door. So then that way they go, oh, that's right. I have to turn off the faucet with the paper towel, but then also open the door if applicable. With the paper towel and then toss it and then they're good. So this is a picture that I like to show. I do the PSA grower training. So if you've seen this one before, I apologize, but I love this one because it does show the areas that people typically miss when they're washing their hands. So something to kind of keep in mind here is look at where the most frequently missed is. That's the deep red, and then the frequently missed, and then the less frequently missed. So as you can see in that red, what do they typically miss? Their thumbs, right? So making sure that the thumbs in between the fingers, and then also, as you can see, your fingertips, right? So making sure that they're properly washing their hands. I know it sounds like a no-brainer. We should all know it, right? But making sure that they're not only getting between their fingers, rubbing their fingers together, getting their thumbs, but then also the back of their hands. Because as you can see, that is also another frequent place that they completely forget to clean. So kind of, again, keep that in the back of your head of, ooh, we need to make sure. You can also do a tailgate training on proper hand washing, making sure to really emphasize, hey, don't forget about your thumbs and between your fingers, your fingertips, because again, as you can see, what areas of your fingers are typically going to be touching the produce? Typically, if you're picking, most of them are touching with their fingertips, right? Because they're wanting to let, a really good grip on it to pull it off. So again, wanting to make sure that there isn't anything there that could potentially contaminate your produce. So you've done all of that. So you just want to reinforce and monitor all of that to make sure that they are doing it, right? If, as far as like for hand washing, there's signs and reminders that you can do, just like I touched on. You can do a tailgate training, making sure, like, hey, making sure you're washing your hands properly, 20 seconds. Make sure you're using soap. Soap is so important. Um, but also something to just kind of keep again in the back of your head. I know a lot of the workers here in Colorado, English is not their first language. So making sure that you have someone who would be able to interpret, or having signs in the language that they speak is very helpful. Also, again, keeping in mind with like literacy levels and stuff is having signs that have a lot more pictures. So then that way, if someone, their reading level might not be as high, they'd still be able to understand what they need to be doing. So again, kind of keep that in the back of your head as far as like for signs and reminders. And then developing that monitoring process, making sure, is someone, you know, when they come back from break, right? Making sure someone's like, hey, don't forget to wash your hands. Are they following any of your other food safety practices, right? Are they putting, the tools that they're using in a designated area? Are they putting their gloves in the container that you have on the truck, or whatever that may look like for you, right? And this can also go into what we were talking about, like cleaning and sanitizing. Are they actually scrubbing your harvest bins? Are they cleaning the bins you're using? Are they cleaning your equipment appropriately? So making sure that that is being followed, and then making sure the facilities are available, clean, and well stocked. I will tell you that if they're not available, clean, and well stocked, they won't use them. So making sure to have all of that and having someone there that can say, hey, we're running out of paper towels. Because this is a big one that we've been seeing is either the paper towel dispenser is broken, or, oh, they just get blown away, so we put them away. Is if someone is washing their hands, right, and they're doing this, they do all the steps, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh, okay, oh, there's no paper towels anymore. Where do you think they're going to dry their hands? They're not going to do this, right? Like, I'm a human too. I know exactly where I'm going to wipe them. I'm going to wipe them on my pants, right? That's just a natural human reaction to, oh, don't have any paper towels. I'm going to just do this, air dry them a little bit, and I'm good. Well, the problem with that is then now you just took your clean hands that are direct food contact surfaces and dirtied them, because especially if you've been harvesting all day, you're going to have dust, you're going to have dirt, everything on your clothes, and you just dirtied your clean hands. So again, it's very important to make sure that, yes, they have soap, making sure that it's well stocked. Again, with the soap, make sure it's soap and not like that hand sanitizer. That is something that is in the rule, that you can't substitute a hand sanitizer instead of using soap, just because the effectiveness of like actually rubbing your hands together and lathering them is what gets, the contaminants on your hand off of them. Now, if they use the porta potties and they use the hand sanitizer when they walk out, they can, but they should also wash their hands. So making sure that that is also happening as well. So as far as resources go, we do have our 2024 annual report. Any of those records that I was talking about are in that annual report. You can find that on our website, or I'd be more than happy to send you a paper copy. So that would be like the cleaning and hand sanitizing template. If you are interested, I will follow up in an email with that EPA sanitizer list. So that way, if you're like, I haven't actually gotten a sanitizer, what would be a good one? I can send that as well. So then that way you have that. But anything else you can find on our website. Any of our other webinars that we've hosted are also up there as well. Also with other resources and record templates there as well. So with that,